Rob D has invested in a property. Now, that would be a great episode in its own right. But Rob D has invested in the middle of a global pandemic. That makes this episode really interesting. This week, I'm going to quiz him on that decision and find out what he's invested in and why.
Welcome to the Property Podcast, where every Thursday morning property investors come to be informed and inspired. And yes, this week we're talking about why I've just invested in a property. The two of us haven't talked about this yet. I've not actually spoken my thought process out loud. So I'm going to actually find it really interesting to find out why I've invested. And I'm sure you will as well. And stick around to the end for Hub Extra, because we've got a pair of quotes to get you thinking from one of the world's all-time great investors.
It's time for our news story of the week, and this week we've taken a story from Landlord Today, and the headline reads, "Renters will feel more secure following extension of the tenant eviction ban." The tenant eviction ban was a measure introduced a few months ago when COVID kicked off as a method to protect tenants, and Rob, that protection is going on for at least a few more months.
Yeah, it was originally due to end on the 25th of June. I think the hope was that by then people would be back at work and maybe things would be back to normal a little bit, but that hasn't happened as quickly as had been hoped. So they've now extended the ban till the 23rd of August. And of course, there is a possibility that it will be extended again, but now we know it's until at least the 23rd of August. So it's a tricky one. There are obviously lots of tenant groups who are very happy about this. Landlords in general, I don't think, can be too unhappy about it because it's very clear why this is being done. And clearly this was a serious situation where action needed to be taken. But we've also heard from individual landlords who've got tenants who are, for example, exhibiting antisocial behaviour, causing all manner of problems, not related to the virus or rent arrears or anything else, and they're unable to do anything about it. So it's a difficult situation, always difficult to balance the interests of the two parties, especially at the moment. But hopefully, for the sake of all concerned, if nothing else because it means the world will be somewhat back to normal by then, it won't be extended again beyond the end of August. But we'll have to wait and see.
Now, if you're a regular listener to the podcast, you would have heard me mention a deal that we've been working on in Nottingham. And it's been going on for months. Well, I'm pleased to say we finally made that deal and we launched it through Property Hub Invest. And on the launch evening, it sold out in less than a minute. Yes, 10 houses in Nottingham sold out in less than a minute. Crazy, right? Well, yes, it was great to see that there were so many investors so confident in that particular investment, particularly after spending so long putting it together. But there was one special investor, and they were all, of course, special, but one at least as special to me, who made an investment and took one of those properties. And that was our very own Mr. D. So we thought we have to podcast about why he's invested. Because I'm being completely honest, I still don't know. We've been that busy, we haven't caught up to chat about why he's invested. Of course, I know it's a great deal, but beyond that, I don't know. So it's not only you learning today, it's I'm learning as well. So Rob, you ready to be put on the spot?
I am. I'm actually really looking forward to this conversation because I've not spoken to anyone about it yet, and I'll probably learn more about my motivations as a result of having the chat. So let's get into it.
You'll have to pass this episode on to your wife afterwards. So the first thing I want to know is, were you actively looking to make an investment?
Going into this year, I absolutely was. Because I didn't invest at all last year. I was putting money into the development project that I've talked about on the podcast before and not making any return on that money. And I was also investing in the business. So from both a money perspective and a time and focus perspective as well, last year just didn't happen for me. So going into this year, I really wanted to make an investment. It was literally on my to-do list for the year in Trello. When the pandemic hit, my assumption was that would slow things down. And it definitely wasn't the case of, brilliant, global pandemic, now's the moment, let's go. But the right deal came along.
Now, I know that you're a big fan of Nottingham and you've already got investments there. Was it only Nottingham for you, or were you looking at other areas? What were you looking at? What were you considering?
Nottingham was a big focus area for me. I've spoken about why I like Nottingham many times on the podcast in the past. And while we've also talked on the podcast before about how we're open to owning property pretty much anywhere if it works, it doesn't have to be all within a specific focus area. I do have a bit of a Nottingham focus and I was keen to do more there. And it being Nottingham certainly helped me make a move right now because it's an area that I know well. So it wasn't like Nottingham or nowhere, but it was definitely another entry in the pros column for me.
What other towns or cities would have been in the pro column for you? So Nottingham, a clear favourite with yourself, but where else are you liking right now?
I think it's all the same places that we talked about when we were doing our hotspots, really. My strategy now is quite closely aligned to the type of thing we've talked about on the podcast before, which is buying quality at a good price and holding it. And the areas that we've talked about, like Liverpool and Sheffield, where there are some really quality products and demand is growing and prices are still low, so there's upside there, that fits that strategy. I've been looking a bit at Newcastle as well. I've not actually been there and I've not got anywhere near looking at individual investments or pulling the trigger, but just getting interested in it because it's one of those places where prices are still below their last peak and it's fundamentally a strong city. So I think there's something interesting there. I do think it's currently a bit early though. So that had been on my radar as well. But it's all essentially getting at the same thing, which is trying to find quality stock in an area of growing demand where pricing is still competitive.
It's really interesting that you name check Newcastle there because the other ones are obvious. We both talked about those in our hotspots video on YouTube, but only in the last week or two we've been contacting developers in Newcastle, very early stages, but just initial contact to let them know we're here and we exist and we can help them like we do with other developers in Yorkshire, Midlands and the Northwest. But what's really interesting is neither of us have talked about that. We've both independently gone and done that. And at some point, I'm sure would have had that conversation, but one of those sickening alignment things again, Rob, where we're operating and thinking the same way, which is really cool. So at what point did you go, okay, this investment is of interest to me? Because you mustn't have had the information for long because we'd only just put it together for the investment launch to the investors at Property Hub Invest. So for people listening, Rob didn't get a preview weeks and weeks in advance of all the information. He knew something in Nottingham was coming. He knew the headline information. But Rob, you only got the core investment information maybe a day or two before everyone else, but not much more.
No, literally a day. I knew that something was coming up. I knew where it was because the team knew that I had some knowledge of Nottingham. So when the opportunity first came up, they said to me, what do you think of this area? So I Googled it and said, oh yeah, that's actually a really good location. But I didn't think any more of it. But I wasn't actually involved in putting the materials together. I remember actually seeing them for the first time and going, wow, this is really strong, and going through it and getting more and more excited. I'll be honest, there's got to be something of an emotional component to this. We talk about keeping emotion out of deals. I think it's really important to do so. I also think it's impossible to do so completely. And it helps that it was a really beautiful looking development. That plays into the investment strategy as well, but it certainly made it easier to look at the pretty photos and get excited about it than it would be if it was a bit more of a utilitarian investment.
Yeah, it was easy to fall in love with this one. I know that wasn't the reason why you invested, but it does help. So other than it looking great, what was the trigger for you to go, right, I'm in? What were the boxes ticked for you? Other than it being Nottingham and it looking great, what else was satisfying your needs for you to make an investment decision? Because you made it pretty quickly.
For me, it ticked a lot of the boxes for my strategy in different ways. So location is one, both in it being Nottingham, but also the prime part of Nottingham. Another one being premium stock. And that's something I want because it gives greater potential for capital growth and tends to be easier to manage and take your pick of tenants. Also, a big factor is the fact that they were houses. So this is a 4-bedroom house. I don't have any big houses in my portfolio. I've got some smaller ones, but nothing that big and nothing that premium. It's actually quite rare to find 4-bedroom houses that stack as an investment at all because the price point is higher, and particularly unusual to find a really premium 4-bedroom house that works as an investment. So I wanted that as a diversifier. And that also plays into the last point, which is however much I understand intellectually that over the long term, it's the capital growth where you make most of your money, I need to be able to see a return. I just can't shake it. And actually stacked up really well. I'm really pleased with the rental return that's projected, and I'm really happy to just collect that for years, even if there's no movement in the market for a reasonably long time. And a kind of a subtle sub point of that is that in itself is kind of an indicator that there is growth to come, because it seems like an anomaly that's going to be corrected at some point. You shouldn't be able to get a property like this in this area of this quality and still make a rental return on it. You can now. It seems likely that in the future prices should go up, so that's not possible anymore.
Probably do a whole podcast based on that answer because there's so much to unpack there. I'd encourage people to go back and listen through that answer and take out bit by bit why Rob invested. But to pick out 3 highlights for me, and all of them we've talked about on the podcast in the past, but hearing the theory is great, but having one of us make an investment where those boxes are ticked is even better to help the learning. So one of the points that you've made is invest in the best areas, because a lot of people we'll go and look at Nottingham or Liverpool or Sheffield or Leeds or wherever else and go, right, I've heard great things about these areas, let's invest. And then they'll go and invest in something mediocre or in an area that's not quite there yet and might take a while to get there. For most people, particularly if you're used to southeast prices, investing in the best places in these towns and cities is doable. So, like this house, 4-bedroom executive home, beautiful gated development in a top area of Nottingham for around 300,000. Incredible. And the great thing about investing in a great area is it normally will remain great. So when you have a downturn, you've got an extra level of protection. So if you are investing in the Midlands, the Northwest, Yorkshire, wherever for the first time, don't try and be too clever and go and invest in somewhere that's a bit cheap or up and coming or might have potential. Just go and invest in the best area. It's a lot safer, it's a lot easier to do. Another thing you raised there, Rob, second thing I want to highlight is the combination of fundamentals plus a return equals potential capital growth. Not guaranteed capital growth, but if the fundamentals of an area are great and the yield is attractive, then something is out of balance and it normally doesn't last for that long. So when you do find that combination, and that's what we look for ourselves and for our investors, it really gets us excited because we think, okay, well, in the past, this equation has equal capital growth, so the potential for that happening over the long term is looking pretty good. And finally, it's really interesting to see you diversify within your portfolio by investing in different towns and cities, because you're not wholly exclusive in Nottingham. You've got your portfolio all over the place and different types of property. You're diversifying more than most property investors ever would. You know, as you build that portfolio up, if you concentrate on one town or village or city and you do the same type of investment in that town, village or city, then you are putting yourself at risk. You could have a much bigger upside, but you could have a much bigger downside if you don't get it right. And by investing the way that you have, it de-risks you. So there's a lot that people can take away from your answer there. And there's more as well. So as I said, go back and listen to it. If you pick out all those points and all those reasons Rob invested, I think you'll be making better investment decisions.
When you put it like that, I think I've got more of a strategy than I thought I did. I think I felt a bit self-conscious about my strategy in the past because I've talked openly on the podcast about how I've got it wrong at times and failed to adapt when I should do. But you've done a good job of summarising my thought process there. And not everyone's going to have weight on the same factors that I do. But I think those are all aspects that investors should be considering when making a decision.
Now, we haven't talked about the elephant in the room right now. And the reason this investment is even more interesting, and it's been interesting anyway, is that you've invested during a pandemic, a global crisis where lots of people are fearful and are scared about their futures. And then you've gone and made a property investment in the middle of it all. So was it difficult to make that investment considering everything that's going on? Did you have to think a lot harder? You made your decision pretty quickly, as I've said. So how difficult was it for you to overcome that fear, if you had any fear at all?
I'd say it wasn't that difficult, but it's definitely more difficult than it would have been if this opportunity had come along in January. So in January, it feels like another world right now, but it was a new year, everyone was excited, the market was looking good, we were getting the Boris bounce and everything else. If this particular deal had come along at that point, it would have been 100% yes instantly. Of course, it would be ridiculous if the way that the world had changed since then hadn't factored into my decision. And I definitely hesitated, and I definitely gave it a deeper consideration than I otherwise would have done.
So what did give you the confidence to invest?
There were two things. Firstly, this deal was just perfect for what I was looking for the reasons that we talked about before. If this had come along a few months ago, it would have been an absolute bite your hand off, yes, let's do this. If I'd let the current situation put me off, it could easily have taken me a year or more to find something that perfect, that good again. So the first factor is the strength of the deal. I wouldn't have been really excited to rush out and buy something average at the moment. I wouldn't want to do that. I only invested because it was a really strong deal. And as part of the strength of that deal, there was also a really nice discount baked in. That really helps because who knows what the market's going to do over the next year, 2 years, 3 years. But having that discount in there de-risks it very nicely. The second factor is my strategy, which is very much long-term buy and hold. And that's not going to be the right strategy for everyone, but it's mine. And that makes it far easier to be somewhat more relaxed about the current situation. If I was investing now with a time horizon of 2 or 3 years, it probably wouldn't be making much sense to invest because, like I said, we've got our opinions about what's going to happen. We've talked about them extensively over the last few weeks, but we don't know. What I feel like I do know with relative certainty is that in 20 years, the market is going to be in a stronger place than it is today. Therefore, I'm not that bothered about what it's like in a year's time. Of course, I'm not going to be delighted if I buy and then prices drop by 20%. That's not something I want to happen. I'd far rather buy in at the lowest possible point. But given that I'm getting a discount, I'm collecting rent that I'm very happy to sit and collect every month, and even without any growth, that alone keeps me happy. And if prices do drop over the next couple of years, it makes absolutely no difference to me except on paper. Those ultimately were logical arguments that overcame the very natural, I think, fear of investing at a time like this.
I think what's really interesting is that you said that, if this was 6 months earlier and this deal came along, no brainer, you invest straight away. You don't even need to think about it. But that's the thing. It's only this current climate, this global crisis that we're working through right now, is that this deal could be made because, as people would have heard on the podcast, we've been taking a long time to put this particular deal together. And it was only the market uncertainty that allowed us to push back and go, no, come on, let's do this deal, that they eventually went, okay, now in this climate, I'm willing to accept that price. So in a way, possibly it was COVID that made your investment decision easier. Who knows? So you've talked about how this is an investment for the long term. You've talked about your attitude to price movement right now and how you take the long-term view. One thing that isn't long-term is getting it let for the first time, because you don't want that to be a long-term thing. But some people may be nervous for you that, is he going to get a tenant? Like, what are you going to do there? So what's your view on that?
That is really interesting because that's something that I found myself thinking about. And normally, obviously, I'm thinking about whether there's tenant demand, but I'm not thinking about that by the time I'm actually making the do I buy this decision or not, because I'd already factored that in far earlier in the process when thinking about where I'm going to buy and what I'm going to buy. So that question's kind of answered itself. There is that extra layer to it at the moment, which is, will this current situation prevent it from getting let? And that is something that was on my mind, but there were a few reasons that helped me get past that. One is, God bless how long it takes to buy and sell property in the UK. By the time it completes, so let's say it's going to be a couple of months, my assumption is viewings are going to be a lot easier and the market's going to be moving faster again. So that helps. Another is the area and the product. Again, it comes back to the quality of the deal. In this particular area, there's hardly anything for rent, and I know that things rent quickly. So it'll be slower if the rental market is struggling, but it'll still be relatively okay. And the third thing is it plays back into this whole thing about it being a long-term investment. It's not nice to have an investment that's sitting empty. It's not nice to be paying out the mortgage and the council tax and not have anything coming in. While that's happening, if it does happen, I'm not going to be delighted. But it's also not going to make or break the investment. It might make the first year's return look bad, but over 20 years, it doesn't make any difference. And I can afford to have the property empty if I have to. It's not going to push my finances to the edge. And I'm also perfectly willing to take a hit on the rent for the first year. If in order to get it let, I need to let it for less than the number I've got in my head that I think it's worth, then I will. It's not a problem because, again, it's only a year. I think it's true to say that a situation like this with a pandemic is pretty much a one-off, or at least close to a one-off in our lifetimes. But it also happens if you're investing in new build property every time. You're always adding a fair chunk of supply to a market at a particular moment in time, and it takes a bit of time for that to be worked through. Now, this is only 10 houses, but it's a small area. There's not that much turnover. So that is adding some extra supply that would take longer to work through at the best of times anyway. But that's something I'm aware of and something I factor in.
So you're in the middle of this investment. It's not completed yet. You've got a lot to do. And I know Property Hub is keeping you busy as well. But what's next? You had time to think about that yet?
Not really. But it is weird how I'm no less excited about investing than I was at the start of the year, and possibly more so. I think it's a bit of natural contrarian coming out. And I know that there will be other really good deals to be done. I'm definitely not going to be rushing out to deploy all my cash in the next couple of months because it's the opportunity of a lifetime. I don't think that's the case, but I do think that there are going to be really good deals to be done. I wouldn't go out and buy something average, but I will be dedicating more time than I otherwise would to going out and looking for something truly great, because I think there's a higher chance that it will be out there. And we are at a moment of real risk and uncertainty at the moment. But I find for me, because my time frame is really long, I think about the worst possible case, and the worst scenario I've seen is prices fall by 30%. I think there's a close to zero chance of that happening. But I think about the possibility of that happening and think, how would I feel about that? The answer is I wouldn't feel good, but I've lived through drops bigger than that in other investments that I own. So I know emotionally I could handle it. And over the time frame that I'm talking about, I know that ultimately it'll all be okay. So this is a market where you've got to be very cautious. But I am finding myself more engaged and a little bit excited than I otherwise would have been. Maybe I should be more worried. I don't know.
This has been brilliant, Rob. And I know I'm not going to be the only one grateful for you sharing all this and the insights to your investment. But what do you feel is the biggest takeaway from all this information that you've passed on here? What should people be taking away from this, from your experience and your decision?
I think the biggest thing that you can take away from this, and this isn't going to be the first time you've heard this thought expressed on the Property Podcast, but it's a really nice illustration of it, is that you should be extremely clear about what you want and why you're investing. And there are two reasons for that. The first being that not everyone should be doing what I'm doing right now. You might have different opinions about the market that lead you in a different direction anyway. So you might think that 30% drop that I said close to no chance, you might think there's a very strong chance. So that might take you in a different direction. But even if we were aligned on our thoughts on the market, our strategies might take us to completely different places. What I'm doing is what I believe is the right thing for me to do based on my strategy and my personal situation. So this shouldn't be Rob D's buying, I should rush out and buy right now. Or it shouldn't be you go and read something doom and gloom in the paper and go, this guy's saying everything's terrible, so I shouldn't do anything right now. It's neither of those. It's work out what's best for you. And you can only do that by understanding your own strategy and your own goals. The other reason is that because I'm at this point very clear about what it is that I want, what I'm investing for, how long I'm investing for, what works for me and all that kind of thing, it made it very easy to make the decision. Not easy, I've said it was difficult, but not that difficult. If I hadn't known what I wanted and what would be the perfect investment for me, then I wouldn't have known when it came along, and therefore I wouldn't be able to override the concerns that I had. And if you're not there yet, you don't have that level of clarity, don't feel bad about it. It's taken me years of podcasting about it, which is actually a really good way to find out what you believe because it forces you to think very deeply about it. And I've got it wrong in the past, as I've talked about. But I think for those two reasons, it really is a great demonstration of the power of being clear about what you want, what you're investing for, and what the best way of doing that is for you as an individual. That's not an easy thing to do. It takes time, but it shows that all the time that you do spend getting to that point is time well spent.
So hopefully that turns out to be another very successful investment for Mr. D. But he's not the only person having success. We like to highlight people who reach out through our social channels or on the forum or on iTunes via a review. And that's where this week's story has come from, iTunes. Someone's left a lovely success story there. And they've said, thanks to this podcast, I purchased my first buy-to-let property in December. It's now been renovated and despite the current climate, we'll have a tenant moving in this week. The thought of using a remortgage and interest-only mortgage would have made me panic in the past, but after the education I've received through this podcast and the related materials, I am now so confident about my property journey. Keep up the good work. Well, thank you. Your name on iTunes is Melonheads. I don't know if that's your real name, but if it is, then even more congratulations of navigating life with that name. But to invest so calmly through the last few months and deliver that result is brilliant. And well done for applying the knowledge. It's one thing learning and trying to absorb all this information, but then being clear about what you want, as Rob's talked about, and then taking action on that plan is what makes all the difference. So congratulations to you, Melonhead.
Time now for Hub Extra, that bit of the show where we give you that little bit more, whether it's a tool, a tip, a resource, or just something to think about, like we're doing in today's Hub Extra. And you'll find this backed up by the Hub Extra email that hits your inbox every Friday morning if you're a Property Hub member. And this week, Rob, we've got a quote to think about. It's a quote from Warren Buffett, a very quotable chap. He's got one that's particularly famous, which is be fearful when others are greedy and greedy when others are fearful. That's one you see all the time, but there's good reason for that. It's a powerful statement. But he's got plenty of other less well-known quotes as well. And this one I really like, Rob. He says, only buy something that you'd be perfectly happy to hold if the market shut down for 10 years.
Yeah, it's the perfect quote for this episode, really, because you've talked about how your strategy is for the long term and whatever happens in the short term, you can deal with emotionally because you know long term where the market will end up. And that's a great question to ask yourself when you make an investment. Say, if I was forced to hold this for 10 years, would I be happy? Now, if you're investing for the long term, then it seems like a very obvious question to ask. But it's also a good question to ask yourself if you're doing flips or other short-term strategies, because sometimes you may be forced to hold an asset for the long term. And by asking yourself that question, it can actually then make you really analyse the investment you're about to make. Yes, it could be a good short-term investment, but is it strong long-term as well? Because if it is, then the chances are that you're making the right decisions and choices. But by applying that to your decision-making process, you'll only become a better investor. So yes, Warren Buffett's fearful quote applies absolutely to right now, and Rob, you've applied that to a T, but his 10-year approach is just as apt.
So that is us done for this week. I'd love to know what you think of this episode. We always love to get your feedback. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube, where there's lots of extra content for you as well, at Property Hub UK. And there's always a conversation going on the forum at propertyhub.net/forum as well. We will see you next for Ask Rob and Rob on Tuesday. Until then, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.